Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Property. I'm your host, Cheryl Leong from Property Development Australia. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. At the Business of Property, we interview superstar guests in the property development space that share their expertise, their deals, and their stories to help empower, build, and grow our community of property investors and developers. Hello, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube land. Give me a shout out if you're here with us today, because we've got a very cool topic and a very cool guest talking about how to replace your income with co-living properties. So Henry Vila is a builder and project manager with about 25 years of experience. And his focus at the moment, over the last few years, has been about rooming houses and the space of co-living. He's actually a committee member in a Victorian body for rooming house operators and participates in the review and the legislation and consultation of these sorts of properties. And why I wanted to have Henry join us was really to tell us about this space of co-living, but also, how, he has stories around people he's helped replace their incomes and create financial freedom. So I thought, oh my goodness, our community definitely wants to know about that. So without further ado, may I please invite Henry down to the Business of Property dance floor.
Hi, Cheryl. Thank you for the invitation.
Hello, Henry. Fantastic to have you here on this cool evening. Awesome. Henry is from Stone Horizon. Henry, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this space of rooming houses and co-living?
Yeah, it's listen, like most of the stories in property, is a story that didn't necessarily got all pre-planned in advance, or that was all sort of in a straight line. So I spent about 20 years in the corporate world, having a pretty busy career and thinking that I was being happy and kind of chasing the dreams of others for a long time. And eventually, once my family kind of grew, I really became unsustainable. So the last year as an employee, I spent 220 nights away from home, and it started to get
Wow.
really impact me, my family, and particularly my kids. So something had to change. And you talk about this a lot. Property for me started as a vehicle to kind of get out of that job and out of that career. Little did I know that I was going to fall in love with property itself, and that it was going to take me on in a few different directions. So first as a developer, like many people listening to this, and eventually just chasing sort of more cash flow oriented strategies. First for me and my own portfolio, but eventually obviously being a builder, allowing me to help others as well.
Yeah. And what was it about property that you fell in love with?
Listen, I am an engineer by training, so I like building stuff. But in my corporate career, I built really intangible stuff, right? I built technology systems and processes and a whole bunch of things that are, they were nice, but they were really abstract in nature. Going into property allowed me to effectively play with a massively big Lego set. And at the same time that I was doing that, I was actually creating a lot of actually value, right? So again, sometimes for others, sometimes for me. But I think if any of us kind of listening to this is allowed to sort of make a whole bunch of money while playing with Lego sets, well, that sounded like the perfect job for me. And it's really a dream come true.
Yeah, absolutely. And at what point did you sort of think, oh, I have to actually create cash flow as well? Because I mean, often we think of development and it's, build to sell, profit for it, next one. Was there a point, or has that always been from the beginning where you decided I'm going to build for cash flow?
No, it wasn't from the beginning, actually. So again, like many people listening to this and part of the group, I started doing developments because that's where the big boys play. That's where the big bucks were, right? And I did quite a few projects kind of that way, right? So, as a developer first, and then as a builder developer later on. But a couple things happened, right? The first one is someone really, really close to me who've been playing in similar parts of the property kind of game for quite a long time, realized that after 10 or 15 years of chasing these developments, he just couldn't stop, right? Because he was hooked into the income produced by these developments. And as most of us know, in development, if you do a development, you make some money. If you stop doing the developments, then money stops as well. And I saw myself into that mirror, and I realized that I wanted to have options. So, and that cash flow was going to take quite a while, for some people, really long time to kind of build up. So I said, well, if this is going to take, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years, I better start now and have some of those options. If 10, 15 years from now, I end up, tired or not wanting to do what I'm doing anymore, right? I wanted to effectively avoid a repeat of what happened to me in the corporate world, where I really loved my job for a while, and then after a while I didn't. So little did I know that I was going to find a strategy that was really, really going to accelerate that cash flow journey and, turn that 50-year process into, only a handful of years, really.
Yeah. And so when you went on this sort of, journey to look for cash flow, what were the options that you had considered?
Listen, so, and again, this will be very familiar for some of the people in the group kind of looking at cash flow options. So I knew a couple of people who've gone and what I call muscle up their portfolio into being kind of positively geared, effectively by holding to it for a really long time, buying or developing a whole bunch of negatively geared properties, and then by nature 15, 20 years later, rents go up, but obviously the debt kind of stay pretty much the same, so eventually becomes positive. So that was one option. Not particularly attractive to me. Negative gearing hasn't been particularly my thing from the very beginning. You can tell by my accent I wasn't born in Australia, so maybe I didn't get the chip when I became a citizen that they put into all Australians who love negative gearing.
That's a negative gearing. Losing money is good for business.
So that was one option. And then it's like, okay, well, what are really the positive cash flow, positively geared kind of options out there? So I found a couple of investors who specialize in investing in regional properties, where the dynamics of the economics of property kind of, become more, I call them normal, more like the rest of the world. The problem with those properties is they're really, really small steps. So you need a lot of those properties at, $300, $400, $500, positive cash flow each to really make a dent on a reasonable income. So that wasn't it. Commercial was probably one of the strongest candidates at the time, but I already saw a trend where, because commercially it's really, was really the main kind of positive cash flow game out there in the market. The market forces were sort of bringing the prices up, which was bringing the yields down, and eventually kind of you're partnering with whoever's renting your space. That business goes out of business. You're pretty much dead in the water. And coming out of the GFC, that wasn't a nice place to have. And then eventually I looked into kind of more, let's call them less traditional options, things like Airbnb. But again, the lack of clarity on regulation didn't really sit well with me. Again, I come from a part of the world where the rules are really, really sort of bendy. And I wanted a really, really sort of solid place to be in. And then eventually found rooming houses where, in Victoria particularly, the rules are super clear, and they have become even clearer in the last few years. It's very, very clear what can be done, what cannot be done. Not only that, but the cash flow results for some of those properties it's like nothing else in residential real estate. And you get the extra advantage of still owning residential land, which, gives you potential access to equity growth and to capital growth. Not that I invest for those reasons, but hey, if you can get it, it's a nice cherry on the top of the cake, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you us that are not familiar with rooming houses, number one, what is a rooming house? And number two, what makes Victoria so special?
Yeah, and maybe I'll talk about a third question you haven't asked, which is how the type of rooming houses we build are different to the general one. Listen, rooming houses have existed in Australia and in Victoria in particular for probably 100 years now, right? It's kind of a concept that kind of got imported from the UK a long time ago and really was made popular after the wars, after the First World War, after the Second World War. After things like Vietnam to a lesser degree, where a whole bunch of people came back to Australia, if either after a long kind of deployment without necessarily a family to go back to, or wanting to go to a different place of the country. So it is kind of, I'll call them sort of multi kind of rental properties. The original rooming houses from 100 years ago were a whole bunch of rooms with a few bathrooms shared between all of those rooms. They weren't necessarily the nicest place to live at, but it was a really affordable way of putting a roof over sort of people's heads. Now, what we build today is very different to that. So we use the same regulatory framework, still technically a rooming house, even though we don't like using that name too much because it has a whole bunch of connotations. When you say a rooming house, people don't necessarily think
it's bikies, druggos, and
and other words that I'm not going to repeat here is going to be recorded. But so our concept is very different. You can see it sort of behind us. So we call it, modern living for young professionals. Like, okay, so how we can use that regulation to provide really high quality accommodation for someone who doesn't want a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom, double lock-up garage house, right? Who maybe doesn't have the inclination to go and do a whole bunch of maintenance and lawn mowing and all that sort of stuff that a big house needs to have, but at the same time doesn't want to kind of go and get 3 strangers and rent a house, a share house with them. So we took a lot of inspiration from what's happening in other parts of the world. So I'm lucky enough to have family in the United States and in people like New York City. And so we've taken over there, people live in like really small spaces. So we've taken a lot of inspiration over those relatively small or really small, but super functional spaces. And we applied that concept and some of those principles together with a regulatory framework of kind of rooming houses to produce effectively a new product. Sometimes we call them studios, sometimes we call them micro apartments, to kind of try to differentiate them from the old style rooming houses. But it's effectively, a private space where each resident, each tenant, if you like, has their own bathroom, their own kitchenette, their own private space, where they can share with the people around them if they want to, but they don't have to. They're effectively living into something that is really close to a small studio apartment on kind of
and generally they're in the property which effectively looks like a house.
Yeah, so the basic structure looks like a house. These are, most of our properties are single story. They're designed to blend with the environment they're in and the neighborhood they're in. So if you're in a suburban area or in a regional town, our properties will look like the average house in the street. Now it'll be a little bit bigger, and the inside will be very different. So once you go into kind of the main door, then you'll have a corridor with like 9 different micro apartment, 9 different rentable spaces. So, but from the outside, it effectively looks like a house. From the inside, it's obviously designed, purposely built for this type of product.
Yeah, and so how many people can you have in a rooming house?
Yeah. So, and again, that goes back to your other question, which I didn't quite answer, which is why Victoria?
Yes.
In Victoria, we're lucky enough to have, a really, really strong, really clear, and really favorable regulatory framework for this type of property. So the Victorian government really, really wants to partner with private investors to kind of build these properties to provide affordable accommodation, right? So now they haven't done it by putting in subsidies or any of the other stuff that other states have done. What they've done is they remove a whole bunch of red tape to allow investors to do what they do best, to go and invest, create these properties, and then sure, part of that sort of profit from the process. So it's literally one of those strategies that is really a win-win. So it's a win for the investor because returns are amazing, to be honest. It's a win for the people living in there because they live in a really, really high-end property in terms of finishes and amenities, but at a much more affordable price. And it's good for the government too because they're solving an affordability issue that it's in their hands. So those three things together are a good mix. Now, what does the regulatory framework look like? What sort of properties we build, how do they look like? So in Victoria, we can have up to 9 rentable spaces on the same property in the same title. And more importantly, we don't need to go through a planning process. We don't need to go through a DA or through a planning permit, all which means the same thing depending on which state you are. We can go directly to we call it a building permit. In all the states, you can call it, a private certifier or a BA to endorse the plans and go straight to build. So we've been given a planning exemption by the state government that says, provided we meet a certain number of rules, then we can go straight to construction. So that means we can go from settling on the land to first tenant moving in probably 6 to 8 months. Which is clearly advantageous for the investor. But also there are some rules there around how does that property need to look like. So, and then obviously the design that we put to kind of maximize the amenity for those people living there.
Great. And so 9 lettable areas equates to how many people? Is that 9 people?
Yeah. So we can have up to 12 people living in there. So we again, we have a few limits, and what we've done, particularly we have a product, sort of a package product that we call Cashflow Maximizer, where we basically, stretch to the boundary of every single rule out there that provides kind of the best outcome for investors, right? So that involves, we have 9 micro apartments, which have 9 bedrooms, right, and 9 kitchenettes, 9 en suites. So 9 effectively lettable areas. Now, the maximum number of people living in one of these properties is 12, which means that you can have up to 3 couples living in 3 out of those 9 rooms, and then the rest has to be single, right? So you can have up to 12 people living in there all up.
Okay, right. And I guess the question that everyone's going like, I can't even live with my, how do I live with up to 12 people under one roof?
Yeah.
How do you manage that?
Yeah, and this is where we've created a product that solves that problem. It's exactly what we've done, right? Yeah. So again, the term co-living is a little bit misleading to a degree because it gives the sense that we're all sort of living together and we're like a one happy family sort of mingled together. People have tried that, particularly in Victoria, and it hasn't gone brilliantly well. Because exactly what you're saying. So people don't really like to be forced to living with others, right? That's why share houses are kind of complicated to manage. So what we've done is we created each of these 9 lettable spaces, right, or rentable spaces, is effectively completely independent from the other 8. Yeah. So you don't have housemates. You have more like neighbors. Yeah. Now, like anyone who lives in an apartment, you might know your neighbors. You might decide to share with them if you want to. Some people prefer not to, and they keep to themselves. There's really nothing that they need outside of their own micro apartment. So, and that makes things like, conflict management a lot easier. There's still a little bit of extra work. You still want to make sure that you have the right people living in the property, the right mix of the 9 tenants. But we do that largely by tenant selection. We choose the right tenants and we manage them properly. It's a lot less likely to lead to conflict and to problems later on.
Yeah. So, in saying that, you mentioned about tenant selection, and it's not property management; it's people management, right? So, do you need to engage a different type of property manager?
Yeah, great question. Listen, we started this business as a builder, right? It's like, well, I'm a builder. I'm going to build these properties for myself originally, right? And then once we went on that journey, we obviously, next question was like, okay, who's going to manage these properties? Now, we did try to engage with 2 or 3 key, really high-profile real estate agents to go and manage these properties, even though, they were kind of pretty close to an apartment. They were not an apartment, right? We're still talking about small spaces. We're still talking about dynamics. A whole bunch of compliance is very different. The operations are, there's licensing requirements. There's a whole bunch of these things. So after a while, I just gave up. I realized these people were just not set up to manage the type of properties we built. So, eventually I hired my own property manager with the intention of managing my own portfolio. But then we very quickly realized that there was a really big need for specialist property management on this type of properties. So today, most of the properties we build, we sort of manage in-house. We have a specialist sort of property management department here that we kind of manage most of the properties we build. But there's other property managers out there that are also specialized, who are doing a great job at managing these really, really specialized type of property. And there's some people who decide to manage themselves, and they can get some assistance from the market and from other people on how to learn to manage those properties, and then obviously keep some of that some of that budget to themselves. So there's a whole bunch of options available there.
Yeah. So the third thing that you added, why you're building differently to the other rooming houses or traditional rooming houses?
Why? Listen, there's a couple of reasons.
Why or how?
Yeah. So listen. So the properties we build effectively provide sort of independent living for most of it, right? That provides a couple of advantages, right? The first one and the most obvious one is if the accommodation, if the place you're renting is higher quality, you're more likely to command high rent. Yeah, that's primarily the main reason why I did it as an investor when I was kind of building the first few of these, right? Now, we very, very quickly realized that because the rent is slightly higher, that also get us the better tenants. So if you think about the spectrum of tenants going from kind of down here to up there, the bottom one probably cannot afford or does not want to pay that extra premium, right? It's only the people who have a job, who know they're going to take care of the property, who's sick of living from share house to share house, that is willing to kind of make the extra investment into this type of accommodation. So we realized it was getting us the better tenant. Also, because it was more desirable, it also gave us more choice of tenants, right? Like a lot of people will apply to it, but you only need 9 tenants in each of these properties anyway. And just to use an example, so the first property that I finished, I had 52 applications in 3 days for 9 of these rentable spaces. So I could be really, really selective and really, really screen my potential prospects down to find the 9 best ones that will stay there for longer. Because again, there's no conflicts. There's no, it's like someone renting an apartment. Now, if their circumstances change, sure, they will want to move into a kind of bigger place, or if they need to change locations. But other than that, there's very few reasons for them to move out. So they stay longer,
Mm.
they pay more, and they also take better care of the property because, again, they're going to stay there for a long time.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about that. You mentioned then, a bit of a premium on the price of the rooms. Let's start to move towards some numbers. And we've got a question here about buying and selling rooming houses. But before that, I'd like to talk about what sort of rental you can expect per room and start to give people an idea when you talk about incredible returns. What does this look like in numbers?
Yeah. So, listen, I was actually talking to a client today who's kind of super broadly open at doing a property like this, and we were talking about, all right, so when we say it's great rent, what do we mean by great rent, right? So now, like almost every property asset in this country, location is super important, and it will have a big impact on what that rent is, right? So I'm talking, I'll talk first in generalities, and then we maybe, I'll pick a couple of examples, and we'll talk,
Yeah,
we'll talk about
fantastic.
those, so we can kind of give a few examples for people to realize, right? So, rental for this type of property, everything that we have in the portfolio, I'm pretty sure there'll be more expensive ones, and there might be cheaper ones. But these micro apartments rent anywhere from about $250 per week, all the way up to about $320, $330 per week. Yeah. Now you have 9 of those into each property, right? So the typical rental is somewhere between, now speed math here, so somewhere
Same.
between 2.2 grand, so 2,200 on the kind of lower end of it, and then you'll end up with like 2,800 to 332 grand, somewhere around there. Sorry, 3,200 per week. Yeah. So the reality is, when you add all of that, and we like to analyze these numbers, is that's the way most people are actually going to think about their salaries and their income. The gross income on these properties is anywhere from about 110 grand all the way to about 140 grand per year.
Yeah. Okay. Big numbers, right? So that's the gross rental. And so,
Yes.
I mean, obviously with everyone else, the gross rental, what are the considerations there in terms of high level maintenance, property management? Those are the two main things. What's your net? What could they expect as
Yeah.
to net
Let
rental
me give you a
before
little bit of a
interest
list.
rate?
Yeah. Let me give you a little bit of a list, and then, like I said, there'll be an opportunity. I'm fairly active in the group, so feel free, people, to kind of reach out, and we can give them kind of a more kind of detailed version of this. But let me talk about what's in that sort of, let's call them expense category, right?
Yeah.
So that's the bad news. There's quite a few more expenses than you will expect in your traditional property, right? First one being maintenance, which everyone has in every property out there. So, and we like to put an allowance for it. Obviously, new house, for the first probably 5, maybe 10 years, there'll be very, very little maintenance. But we would like to think about these properties not today, not 5 years from now. We would like to think about them 15, 20 years
Long
from now,
term.
right?
Yeah.
So there's going to be, the longer it's been, the more likely there's going to be kind of some repairs and some maintenance, right? Second big cost, which not most of properties don't have, is in Victoria, the regulation says for most of these properties, the landlord will pay for their services, and then we'll include it in the rent. Yeah. So that means that there's probably somewhere between 5 and 10 grand of utilities that get paid out sort of every year, right? So that's water, that's gas, that's electricity primarily, right? So now, of course, there's options to do things like solar and do other things to kind of reduce the cost. And also, in our particular style of design, we embed a whole bunch of what we call energy efficiency measures. So, and this is not just a star rating thing and insulation. We basically maxed out all of those things. But we also have things like motion sensors in all the lights in the common areas. We have high efficiency heating and cooling in most of the rooms. But we also have a really, really efficient system. So if you think about the sort of energy efficiency that you see when you go into a hotel, or you need to put your card in to make sure the air conditioning works and all that sort of stuff. We have like the 21st century version of that, where we basically, if no one is in the room, well, you can't have the air conditioning on the heat or the heating at full blast, because that'll be wasteful, but also is being paid by the owner. So we do have a whole bunch of those measures kind of embedded in it to kind of try to reduce that cost.
Yeah.
But there's still a cost of utilities kind of paid by the landlord.
So could you not do separate metering for the rooms?
You can, and some of our clients choose to do that. But there's a regulatory process to go to that. There's also an investment to put metering into those properties. And what we found is that by putting some of these efficiency measures that we put by default, that are part of our, let's call them standard packages, the economic viability of doing some of those additional investments might not be worth it for most investors. So some will be, but some might choose not to do them. But that's always an option, right? So,
yeah. Okay. So we've got the maintenance, we've got sort of, like they said, utilities, property management.
That's right. That's probably the third one, and one of the other ones that can shock some of our clients, right? When they first see kind of the numbers we're talking about, so people are expecting, they're used to doing kind of standard residential property management at, I don't know, 6%, 8%, 10%, depending on where you are in the country. In rooming houses and micro apartments alike, the numbers are a little bit different. So it really depends on how much of the work the manager takes and who the manager is. It can vary anywhere from about 10% all the way up to about 20%. There's some managers who are even more expensive than that, but that's usually sort of the broad range. And it largely depends on how much work the actual property manager does. As I was saying at the beginning, the great thing about Victoria is you have a really, really clear regulatory framework. The bad thing about Victoria is we have a very, very clear regulatory framework. And what I mean by that is that regulatory framework needs to be complied with. So there's licensing involved, there's registration involved, there's fire tax, there's a whole bunch of things that need to be managed. Now, most of our clients, they want to invest in this property, but they don't want to do any of the work, right? They want to be drinking mojitos in the Bahamas, right? Or going and doing what they do on a day-to-day basis. So for this to become a truly passive investment, the property manager, in this case us, if we're doing that for our clients, we take on everything, right? So we operate under our license, we do all the compliance, we manage all the inspections, we do all the reporting, we manage the insurance, the repairs, the cleaning, all that sort of stuff, plus the regular tasks that a normal property manager on a normal residential property will undertake. So again, there's a whole bunch of options there, but we would like to think the most expensive management package we have is a flat 20%, is flat 20% on rent. It's also calculated a little bit different because it's literally flat on rent collected, as opposed to this nickeling and diming thing that real estate agents have got kind of addicted to. For us, is we want to align our incentives. So if we collect rent, the investor is making money, we're collecting a fee on that. If there's no rent coming in, well, we feel bad kind of charging the client for something that is not producing an income for them. So, and those are largely the three big, let's call them operational expenses. Then obviously, depending on how you finance this property, you'll have some finance cost there as well. So.
Yeah. And so just to give, a ballpark or an average, right? When we're after all those expenses and some finance costs, just put on average. So what can someone expect, net in the pocket after?
Yeah, listen. So our average client takes probably about 50 grand clear in their pocket after all expenses, after paying for the mortgage and interest rate, sometimes even paying the principal, to be honest, because sometimes it's cheaper to do it that way than anywhere else. So the free cash flow tends to be about 50 grand on average. Now, most of our properties, most of our clients invest in regional Victoria. where the investment is lower, but obviously the cash flow is a little bit lower too.
Yes.
For metropolitan properties, that number can increase to 60, 70 grand. So depending on where the property is, and obviously also how much money the investor actually has on the deal. Like everyone who's have kept some of the stock they've developed will know that the more money you leave in, obviously the better your cash flow is. So, but on average, it's somewhere between, I will say, somewhere between 50 and 60 grand, depending on where the property is.
Yeah. So I put it out to our audience listening. How many properties do you think you need to make $50,000 a year, right? Because we talked about this earlier, where we've got this sort of mindset when we get into property that we need to build a portfolio of like 100 properties so that I can be financially free. And even with $50,000, people sort of think I might need to have 20 properties to get to that point, or even 10. But this is one property, and you're also, this is what I love about co-living. And I'll put it out there because we've got co-living properties. You've got 9 incomes from one property. So in fact, you are diversifying your risk.
Absolutely. Listen, we ask a whole bunch of questions either through forums like this, and I know there's a couple there that your users already asked. We'll address those before we finish. Don't despair.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay on. Hold on tight.
But we ask, 9 tenants, that must be a nightmare. Yeah, sure, there's a little bit more work for it. That's why some of those fees are a little bit higher. But again, you're not dealing with the tenants. 9 tenants is actually a good thing for me as an investor, right? Because if one of them leaves, I hardly notice, right? Like I'll go and say, why is my payment a little bit lower this month? Yeah, well, we had 1 week where one tenant was out, right? There's also a lot of really, really high demand for these properties, which means that they don't stay vacant for long, right? But I know in mine, for my personal portfolio, this might not be true for anyone out there, but in mine, and I'm an average investor in this type of property, the same as everybody else, my break-even point in most properties is about 4 rooms. So if I have 4 tenants in there, I'm not losing any money, yeah? I'm obviously not making the profit I want to make, but I know that's sort of my safety margin, right? So I'm hugely diversified, right? So if I lose 1 tenant, I'm still making heaps of money. If I lose 2, I'm making a little bit less money, but it's still very, very high cash flow positive, right? If I still have, if I lose 3 or 4, I'm still making money, albeit a little bit. I need to lose a whole majority of them before I physically get sort of into trouble. So, and like I said, it just doesn't happen. So until about 2 days ago, we did not have a single room empty in our whole portfolio that we manage. So that's both mine and our clients, right? Now we have 1 room empty just because the guy moved out 2 days ago. But I assure you that it won't be a week before that someone else moves into that property, so into that particular room. So I'm really resilient.
Let's say at the peak of COVID and lockdown,
yes,
what was the lowest or the highest number of vacancies you had in one property?
Yeah, so this is where the universe.
Sorry to bring back bad memories.
No. So this is going to be surprising for you, Cheryl, and it's going to be surprising for most people listening to this. We went into COVID, and for the first month or two, like I happened to be in the United States as everything sort of started. So we got a lot of the early notice, and from working in construction, we had a whole bunch of crisis plans kind of set out, right? So supplies and a whole bunch of things. One of the things was like, okay, how's this going to impact rooming houses, right? Because we knew, or we thought at the time, that the people who were living in rooming, in our properties, were going to be the ones that were going to be most highly impacted. Immigration was going to be kind of closed down. There were all these things. So we're like, well, we don't know where this is going to end. So like most people, we got really, really conservative really, really quickly. Here's a bit that surprised us, and I'm pretty sure it's going to surprise you. Our vacancy went down, not up during COVID. So we basically filled every room we had available, and our waiting list basically increased by 20%. So Now, at the beginning, we weren't quite sure what were happening. We're like, well, what does how does this, it's particularly because we were hearing mixed stories, right? There were people out there who had sort of
Yes.
more traditional style of rooming houses, and they were really, really struggling to kind of get tenants. Particularly, obviously, if you're investing on an area that is primarily student based, obviously COVID wasn't good for you, right? No international students was really, really a problem, right? But
Yeah.
for us, we
Yeah.
kind of got hardly impacted at all. And what we realized as we got deeper into the numbers and deeper into talking to people and doing the research that we do internally is that we realized that the whole market was being pushed down, right? So people were buying, really high or renting high-end properties. Suddenly they felt like they didn't want to spend that much money on rent. So they went and moved to smaller properties. And a lot of people who were renting like, 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartments or units, they suddenly were like, well, I'm not sure I want to spend my money into that, right? So a lot of them was like, oh, well, here is an option to live in a, reasonable quality place on a much more affordable thing. And I don't know how long this crisis is going to go for. So I'm just going to save my money, move into one of those, and just save the rest for a rainy day, right? Little did we or them know that they were actually going to like the place, so they stayed. So
Yeah.
so yeah. Now I wouldn't say that we it will sound great to say like no we knew this was going to happen. No, we didn't know. We were as scared as everyone else out there.
Yes. Yes.
But this time around,
Yeah.
we, a little bit of luck, a little bit of preparation, and a little bit of having the right principles in terms of, locations and markets, and making sure we had a resilient property in a market that had a lot more demand for the product we were building than properties available out there.
And I would say as well, you'd have people who were living in your traditional share housing, which were sharing bathrooms or whichever kitchens, that probably said, I don't want to be sharing bathroom or kitchens with anyone.
Yeah.
I actually want my own space. So as much as you were seeing people sort of scale down, you're probably seeing people scaling up as well. So it provided a real good middle ground for that. And it's fascinating because that's what we sort of saw as well. Yet it was interesting because and this comes down to the thing about valuations and selling as an investment. So maybe that's a good segue into the question, which was asked probably about 20 minutes ago. I'm so sorry, we got too carried away. How easy is it to buy or sell completed occupied rooming house as an investment? Is there a market for this? Well, this is what you do.
Yes. So it's a couple thends, right? So and there's like a couple versions depending on which that those two pairs, depending on how you combine them, you end up with slightly different answers. So let me try to kind of address them all more kind of generally, right? So the financial model for this type of properties is it's an asset that produces cash flow off the back, right? So now I have this exact same question asked to me probably 3 or 4 times every single week. Yeah. Because it's one of the concerns, right? We are not building a normal house, right? This is not an Airbnb or a normal sort of kind of residential property that if we feel like we don't want to be an investor anymore, we can just turn around and sell it to mom, dad, and 2 kids to move in. It's not that type of property, right? It is a lot similar, and it actually behaves a lot closer to what typical commercial properties, behave like and rent like. But that's sort of where the magic is, because once the house is completed, once the property is completed and it's operating, and if there's 9 tenants in there, or a number of tenants in there, kind of actually produce income, that income becomes more important than the actual building. So evaluator is not going to go and say, oh, well, there's 10,000 bricks in here, and there's, insulation to all the internal walls, and there's emergency lighting, and there's, they're not going to go based on the cost of construction. They're not going to go based on the cost of the land. they're going to go based on the income it produces and a cap rate, a little bit like in a commercial property, right?
Yeah.
So now that's great for valuations, right? It's great for refinancing. It's great for leveraging kind of some of that manufacturer equity to go and take into the next deal. But it's also a good representation of the way the market looks like at these properties. I said before that I'll probably get this question asked probably 4 times a week. What I haven't said yet is that 2 of those people are probably thinking, well, if this doesn't well, can I sell it, right? And I actually don't know your user which angle he's using, right? But some of them goes like, well, if this doesn't work well, can I go and sell it, right? And that's perfectly understandable. It's a new style of property, not everyone understands it. So it's a pretty genuine conversation or question to ask. Now, the other 2 people, they're looking at me and say like, Henry, you're saying this property takes 8 months to get built, yeah? I say like, yeah. So, if I'm happy to pay a premium, can I get it tomorrow? Do you have any for sale, right? So ultimately, here's the thing, right? We don't have a portfolio of properties that we're willing to sell because no one sells them. Why would you sell something that put 50 grand in your pocket every year, right? After all expenses and interest and everything else. So people just don't tend to sell them. The couple of times that we've seen people sell them, it's either their personal circumstances have changed dramatically, i.e., someone's getting divorced or critically ill or someone like that, right? And they immediately kind of sell really, really quickly. Or, someone has decided that they want to let go of an asset that maybe it's an entry-level asset, maybe it's one of our cash flow starter properties that require a smaller investment, but maybe the return on that investment is a little bit lower, to then upgrade to a bigger property or a better location, right? And inevitably, there's a buyer that we're talking to who's ready to buy some of those properties already. So there's not a huge amount of these properties built the right way who are out there trying to be sold and not being able to be sold. Now, there's a caveat to that comment, right? If you're going to realestate.com.au or Craigslist or Gumtree or any of those platforms, and you write the words rooming house and press enter, a whole bunch of stuff will show up, right? A whole bunch of people build the wrong type of product in the wrong location or for the wrong market, right? And then they go try to manage it on their own, right? And muscle their way through it. And, not surprised, it just doesn't work out, right? Like they don't know how to find tenants and in the right, they're in a hard market to start with. And they also don't have the processes and the systems to be able to manage these really, really complicated properties in an effective way. So they end up getting frustrated with an empty house or with a couple of tenants that's giving them a lot of work, and they just put their hands up and go like, I want out. And now they're trying to sell them. But now you're trying to sell a property that is not built correctly, that is probably, used to be a 4-bedroom house, and now you put a couple of random walls in the living room. So it's very clear that it used to be a living room. It's not a high-quality conversion or a purpose-built property for that matter. You can't really show history of cash flow because, you had a couple of people randomly here and there, but mostly it's been empty. It hasn't been particularly well maintained, and it's not in a market that is, you can't show demand, you can't show that this thing is actually going to grow. Not surprisingly, no one wants to buy that property, so they just sit in the market for a long time, right? It's the same as if you buy, if you build the wrong product in your own development, and most of the people in the group will be familiar to this, you go and build the wrong product for the wrong market, not surprisingly, you're going to be stuck with it, and it's going to be really, really hard to end at the end of the day. So for my own strategy, my own portfolio, I have no intention of selling any of my rooming houses ever again, right? So it'll give me cash flow for the rest of my life, and then it'll give cash flow to my kids for the rest of their lives, right? However, I want to make sure that if something really, really bad were to happen and I needed to liquidate that portfolio for whatever reason, I could do that. So I build assets in a way that, maximizes the cash flow, but also maximizes the opportunity of that cash flow for the next buyer, right? The next person who will potentially own that property. Now, my intention is for that to be my kids, but it could be somebody else. And those two drivers are completely aligned to maximize the value of those properties.
Yeah, fantastic, excellent.
Hopefully that helps you ask the question. So
and the truth is, not many people do sell it because it makes such good cash flow. And I'm noticing as well, we've got someone who's jumped on the bandwagon here, who's also building shared housing. I can't tell who it is, but I appreciate that you're sharing your experience as well. We've got about 10 minutes, and I know we want to share some real good heartwarming stories around why it's not just the income side of things, right? But yes, income's one thing, and we talk about replacing your income, but really it's the financial freedom that these sorts of properties have been able to provide for some of your clients that have bought these properties, right? I love one that you talked about, a lady who sold her house and bought a caravan and is just living on, and bought one of these properties. Tell us that one.
Yeah, sure. Listen, and that's ultimately why we exist, right? So Stone Horizon exists so people can get access to 𝐿T's strategy without any of the hassle, right? And ultimately, the big thing with this type of property is because the income is so good, it doesn't take a whole bunch of properties to make a massive difference, right? Made a massive difference in my life, right? Investing into it. But my story is actually not it's really, really boring. So I like talking about some of these other people who were in a very, very different situation to mine, and they're doing some of these incredible things, right? So Janine is one of our clients. She's in New South Wales, and she decided to sell. So she lives in Sydney, basically, and divorced, a couple of kids already kind of grown up, and she wanted kind of some freedom for herself. She wanted to kind of go around the country. So she sold her house, invested the proceeds into one of our properties, a cash flow maximizer property that will, again, 9 micro apartments will put a whole bunch of money into her pocket every year. And then with the rest, she went and bought a Winnebago to then kind of go around Australia. So it's like, well, she has no intention of necessarily being kind of tied to a particular place kind of ever again. Now, she probably will. She'll have, she has grandkids and a whole bunch of other people. So I'm not sure she'll be in the road kind of forever or at all. But she has the option of actually doing that. So she doesn't need to worry of her what she's going to pay the bills with. And again, she was able to do that with just one of these properties, right? Because that's enough to kind of replace an income that she's comfortable with, right? So other people, well, one property might not be enough, right? So we have a client in Adelaide who has a slightly bigger portfolio, but he's building now his last property to become truly financially free. And one of the great things that he came to Melbourne a couple of months ago, and we kind of went out for dinner. And he shared the story with me, right? He went like, Henry, I don't know if you realize, but once you finish this property, I don't need a job anymore. I can resign any day I want, right? And then he, threw in a couple of swear words and, can you please go and finish it quickly, please? And then
can you hurry up?
I will be excited too, right? So it's like, okay, if after a journey, this is like, once I finish this one property, then I'm free. Then I'll be pushing to get it finished relatively quickly, right? Now he needs he's in an executive salary, so he needs a little bit more money than the one property. But it doesn't. I actually asked the people listening to this, right? So how many 50 grand chunks does it actually take, right? So it's 2, 3, 4. It's like not that many, right? So And that's actually true for most of our clients out there.
Yeah, and so like, you know, the our audience here who are thinking, you know, they're looking, and a lot of people are in this community to create some level of financial freedom through property.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? And you think about it, and at its simplest form, if you're able to purchase a vehicle, and I call it a vehicle, whatever it might be, that's going to give you $50,000 in returns. And it's work back. You know, what do you need to replace your income? Is it 150,000? Is it 200,000? Right? And then you can work out what those numbers are in terms of whether it's 2, 3, or 4 properties. Right? And so it's not that much. It's not that much. Obviously, you know, if you want to work out how to finance it and things like that, Henry, I'm sure you've got the right connections to be able to point people in the right direction.
Absolutely. And listen, there's one number that we haven't covered, and I'll throw it out there in case people are asking, right? Because we're talking about this thing, and listen, the reality is you can produce properties that produce 50 grand of cash flow, you know, every year. That's not magical, right? That's like, you know, because you have no context, right? Like if you put, you know, if you invest $10 million on a property and that produces 50 grand a year, that's actually a pretty crappy property, right? But these properties are not like that, right? So most of our projects are, I call them $1 million projects right now. Construction costs are working a little bit against me saying that every day. But, you know, that's kind of ballpark where kind of these properties are. Most of our investors, you know, the ones that are really leveraged, the ones that really, you know, take the finance on and try to do, you know, as much as they can and borrow and leverage other assets and things like that. The ones that are actually getting 50 and not 80, right?
Yes.
They probably have maybe 300, 400, somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 in each of these deals, right? So let's say 400, right? You put 400, you get 50 every year. You know, after 6 or 7, 8 years, you have this thing paid off, right? So you have no money in it anymore, right? So you know, then return becomes infinite, right? So
and even on 400,000, say for you've spent that in deposits and stamp duty and all of that as whichever, but you've got a $50,000 return. That what's that in return on investment? 50.
Yeah, so what's that? So 25%, something like that. Yep. So 15%. I don't know. My math today are a little bit rusty.
Someone who's going to calculate.
Listen, I think it's 12.5% net. So, but like I said, I think, you know, you'll be hard pressed to try to find that sort of return in any residential property. Now, big caveat to all these numbers I'm throwing out there. Your audience probably feeling fine now. You know, I'm great at talking really, really high level. The devil on this stuff, a lot of it is in the detail, right? And even though I'm kind of the numbers I remember off the top of my head, I'm trying to make them fit by using sort of the same examples. I'm trying to use really, really general examples, right? So might be, you know, a good idea for those of you who are listening to this who are kind of really you know, really excited about it and maybe want to know the actual detail. And you know, some of you I know are the down to the dollar person. You know, feel free to reach out to me, send me a DM or put a comment here or something, and we'll be more than happy to send you the actual kind of full detailed breakdown of, you know, all the costs and all the investments. So then that way you can kind of evaluate whether this is something that you might be interested in for you, and not based on what Henry says or what Cherry is asking. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start to wrap that up, if people do want to reach out to Henry, just remember he is in Victoria. They are building stuff in Victoria. So appreciate, and I please ask, obviously no self-promotion for anyone else on unless someone's asked you to. So appreciate if some people can remove their comments. Sorry. And how do we contact you? henryv@stonehorizon.com.
Yeah, that's probably the easiest one. That's my direct email. It'll land directly on my desk. So, you know, feel free to kind of reach out. Our website too, you see it at the back there, you know, stonehorizon.com.au. I'm also pretty active, you know, around here. So, you know, if you write something here, I'll probably see it. I'll be able to respond, and everyone else can benefit from. If you have that question, maybe chances are somebody else has that question. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram thing, and if you look us, you'll find us. We're pretty visible out there, and we're pretty available for people to kind of help out with whatever questions you have, and sort of take it from there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Henry. I know that we could talk about this day in and day out, but the rest of us, and I'm sure people have other things to do, but that was fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your experience in this space with co-living. If you're keen to find out a bit more about that strategy, reach out to Henry. Those are his contact details there. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Henry, I'll see you later. Take care of yourself and keep warm and dry and keep doing awesome things.
Thank you for the opportunity to share. Thank you.
Not a problem as well. Thanks for joining us, everyone, this week on The Business of Property. Make sure you visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Business of Property, where you can find all our past episodes. I do have people that reach out to me saying, I missed a session with Henry, I missed a session with whoever. Go onto our YouTube page and subscribe so you can be informed of when new episodes come up. So you got to hit the like button. So until next time, everyone, keep well, stay safe, and we'll see you again. Take care. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Thank you.